атака. И вновь продолжается бой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Hello, fellas. Today we are going to be going over the foundations of Leninism by Joseph Stalin. A little bit of background information, and this is going to be a short episode. The foundation of Leninism is only about 86 pages. It's a very short, easy read, and it really just goes over a quick introduction to why Leninism is so important as a Marxist expansion of Marxist doctrine to our specific mode of capitalist production, which is capitalism within the imperialist age. And a little background on this book. It's really more so a collection of lectures that Stalin did at a college that was published about a month after Lenin's death within the newspaper Pravda. What's great about this is it's so good for beginners, just to really get a grasp into what Leninism is, why Leninism as a scientific doctrine is so important. If Marx was like Isaac Newton with classical physics, right? The inertia of a mass is the same as whatever, the apple falling down from the tree. Lenin was Einstein, and he brought physics into a new age, right? That's that same way he brought Marxist science into a new way for the imperialist age of capitalism. And Stalin was really able to synthesize Lenin's ideas within this short lecture series in a way that's so easy for the masses to understand and for beginners to understand. So Stalin begins this book by refuting the idea that Leninism is just Marxism applied to Russia. As Stalin states, quote, "We know, however, that Leninism is not merely a Russian, but an international phenomenon, rooted in the whole international development." And that's because Leninism really was. What was so special about Lenin's analysis was that he was able to analyze capitalism as it was globally, right? He was able to analyze the issues of Marxism within Europe at that time and the global Marxist movement, how it was faltering into parliamentarism, how it was faltering into reformism, how it was giving up the revolutionary aspects of Marxism, instead proposing a more equitable capitalism. And so he was able to examine the issues of Marxism at that time, which was revisionism in the Kerensky branch of the Second International. And he was also able to analyze the issues of our current stage of capitalism, which was the new imperialist age, in which a couple handful of finance monopoly capitalists redivided the world into spheres of influence, invested their capital into these spheres of influence. The investment of capital, right? Remember, capital, going back to the classical Marxist analysis from Das Kapital, is surplus value that capitalists get from workers, and they use that surplus value to constantly reinvest it to exploit more workers, to then get more surplus value to reinvest it to get more workers. Exploit more workers. And so this new imperialist stage of capitalism that Lenin found the world within required an expansion of Marxism, of classical Marxism, because Marx and Engels had been working within a European context, right? And their theories needed to be expanded to the expansion of Europe to the global world economy. Leninism, as Stalin proposes, made Marxism not only a revolutionary idea once again, as Marxism had by World War I, when Leninism was developed, become horribly reformist, with becoming a hollow shell of itself within mainstream European circles, but also, quote, took a step forward, developing Marxism further under the new conditions of capitalism and of the class struggle of the proletariat, end quote. Leninism, thus according to Stalin, quote, is Marxism in the era of imperialism and the proletariat revolution. To be more exact, Leninism is the theory and tactics of the proletariat revolution in general, the theory and tactics of the dictatorship of the proletariat in particular. Marx and Engels pursued their activities in a pre-revolutionary period. We have the proletarian revolution in mind, when developed imperialism did not exist yet, in the period of proletarians' preparation for revolution, in the period when proletarian revolution was not yet an immediate practical inevitability. But Lenin, the disciple of Marx and Engels, pursued his activities in the period of developed imperialism, in the period of unfolding proletarian revolution, when the proletarian revolution had already triumphed in one country, had smashed bourgeois democracy, and had ushered in the proletarian democracy, the era of the Soviets. Lenin, looking at imperialism, recognized that imperialism as a stage of capitalism was its final dying stage of capitalism. And this was because of three big contradictions in the age of imperialism. One, monopoly financed capitalism, as opposed to the earlier stages of capitalism where there was some free-ish competition, completely dominates countries, leading to intense clashes between capital and the working classes of these countries. Think about how in America, the class struggle has become so hard, so intensified because of these large multinational finance monopoly companies that are just constantly going to war with us, constantly hoarding resources. The clashes have become intense, especially within our recent context of the COVID era, in which $1 trillion of wealth were transferred from us, the working class, to them. The working class is unable to fight this new monopoly finance stage of capitalism through traditional trade unionism. And then we ultimately only have two options: overthrow capitalism or suffer. Finance monopoly capitalism and the imperialist stage of capitalism leads to an era where even reformism doesn't work anymore, right? Think about it. We've tried reformism before. We got FDR to give us rights, and eventually those rights were eroded away because the contradictions of the finance monopoly era of capitalism lead eventually to the erosion away of all rights. And now we've gotten to a point in the development of it where they cannot even spare us a single right anymore. They cannot even allow in a Bernie Sanders style reformism where they give us free healthcare. We can no longer rely on reformism of capitalism. It has developed to a stage where it can no longer give us any bones and is destroying and eating itself. The second big contradiction of the imperialist stage of capitalism that makes it the final and most highest developed stage of capitalism is that finance monopoly capitalists fight each other. Ultimately, all imperialist countries wish to invest capital, right, money that helps them exploit more workers, and divide up world markets. And this leads them to fight amongst each other, nations fighting each other in inter-imperialist wars over redividing up the world. These inter-imperialist conflicts, however, also have the effect of weakening the global position of capitalism itself. Think about what's happening right now with Trump as he threatens the EU and our closest allies, like within the European Union. These are both capitalists, finance monopoly capitalists that have redivided up the world. And suddenly America is fighting them to redivide up the world for an even bigger slice of the pie for itself. Think about World War I, as the European powers had divided up all of the world from Asia to Africa to the Middle East. They suddenly needed to redivide up the world so that they could get a bigger slice of the pie for themselves because there was none left. And at the end of World War I, Germany lost a lot of its colonies because it lost the war. World War II, very similar thing, with the caveat of there being a large Soviet Union. But the bourgeois, the international bourgeois, are not a unified class. The bourgeois of nations, the finance monopoly capitalists of Britain, of America, of Germany, they only are temporarily allied until they no longer can. And suddenly, when there's nowhere else left to expand, they start fighting each other. And these fights lead to breaks within the system of capitalism. It screams at the seams. Think about how many revolutions happened during World War II, World War I. World War I, we got the Russian Revolution. That fundamentally changed the face of world economies. World War II, We got all the revolutions within Eastern Europe. And afterwards, we got the revolution in Korea with the DPRK. We got the revolution in Cuba a little while after, about 2 decades after. We got the revolution in Vietnam because of the events within World War II. It was a little bit of a chain ball effect, right? A butterfly effect, but it led to the revolutions in Vietnam and Indochina in general, Laos included. So when capitalism breaks at the seams during these inter-imperialist fights, it leads to revolutionary potential. And the third big contradiction is a contradiction between the handful of ruling or civilized nations and the hundreds of millions of colonial and dependent peoples of the world. Imperialism, as Stalin says, is the most barefaced exploitation and the most inhumane oppression of hundreds of millions of people inhabiting the vast colonies and dependent countries. This division of the world between colonizer and colonized for super profits also ends up being the gravedigger of capitalism itself. As it proletarianizes the world, it makes even the most isolated economies part of this world chain economy. It makes even the most isolated peasant economies and tribes workers, part of the working class, going from peasants or something else, part of the working class and tied to an international economy. And in doing business in order to exploit, gives the colonized tools to overthrow their oppressors. The railroads that America and its allies build in order to exploit and export resources within the Congo, the people that the colonizers educate in order to help them facilitate the easier exportation of goods within Africa and Asia. These allow these educated people with industrial behemoths, to turn those tools against their oppressors. Now, just because we no longer have traditional colonies like Europeans directly ruling over the global South, we still have imperialism. We still have these large finance monopoly capitalists within Europe, within the West, that invest their capital within spheres of influence in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Latin America. And so all of these lessons are still so true today. And when capitalism had its breaking point, for example, within our lifetime, as COVID came in like a wrecking ball and broke all of these institutions, led to the international bourgeois scrambling to figure it out. We've seen capitalism break at its seams in, for example, Africa. And while the revolutions within Africa that we've seen that have overthrown French colonialism, neocolonialism, have been brewing for decades, have been through work by Sankaraists, by revolutionaries, by organizers for decades, is the culmination of decades of work. When this little crisis happened, international capitalism broke at the seams and it allowed them to do that final push where within the 2020s, we saw Africa overthrow the failing French neocolonialism that has been dying for a while. And we saw the Sahel break out into a revolutionary fervor, which has given me hope, and I hope it's given you hope. Ibrahim Traore is a shining light within a very crazy world right now. And as we see capitalists, imperialists all over the world fight for the redivision of the world once again, within Sudan, seeing the UAE and Saudi Arabia fighting, within Europe, seeing the EU and Russia fighting, Russian capitalists and EU capitalists fighting, we see once again the world being brought to a revolutionary situation. Now, whether or not this revolutionary fervor can be grasped upon to get something done remains to be seen. Of course, there always needs to be an organized push, but we are once again seeing Lenin's prediction of the inevitability of inter-imperialist fighting coming true once again. Stalin also explains that the Russian Revolution was a world revolution, not a nationalist one in Russia, because it carried with it solutions to all the issues of the imperialist stage of capitalism. That's because, as Stalin asserts, just like Germany, which is on the eve of a great revolutionary process out of feudalism during Marxist time, allowed Marx to analyze universal truths about capitalism through the contradictions that Germany held, right? Germany held almost all the contradictions of world capitalism during Marxist time. Russia became the same thing under the imperialist stage of capitalism. Therefore, revolutionary Russia and Lenin himself, through analyzing the conditions of Russia, which embodied all of the issues of world capitalism, of imperialist capitalism, Lenin, through analyzing that, brought himself to the center of world capitalist contradictions and became the leader of the international proletariat, Leninism. The reason Leninism was needed at the time, as I already stated, but Joseph Stalin needs to reaffirm this, is because on the eve of World War I, the majority of Marxist organizations within Europe had become revisionist, reformist. The thing is, bourgeois ideas, the ideas of the ruling class, are always threatening to infiltrate worker spaces and Marxist circles. And we always have to struggle against that, right? And that's exactly what happened with the Second International, which chose to support their country's fights in World War I, their country's inter-imperialist conflicts within World War I. This distortion of Marxism would even lead to Marxist movements in Europe to think that they could simply vote in Marxism peacefully. As Joseph Stalin explains, quote, "Instead of an integral revolutionary theory, there were contradictory theoretical postulates and fragments of theory, which were divorced from the actual revolutionary struggle of the masses and had been turned into a threadbare dogmas. For the sake of appearances, Marxist theories was mentioned, of course, but only to rob it of its living revolutionary spirit." End quote. These methods that the Second International was employing served them well before World War I. Nobody noticed that they were an issue. But when World War I forced capitalism to break at its seams, as the finance monopoly capitalists began fighting each other, it really threw and revealed what a sad state European Marxism had become under the likes of leaders like Kautsky and Bernstein. It was out of this context of the failure of the reformist Marxists who supported their country's inter-imperialist wars, their country's chauvinistic, nationalist, useless fights in which they sacrificed their workers to redivide up the colonies of the world. It was out of this context that Leninism fixed the issues of the opportunism that had become so rampant. Firstly, by returning Marxism back into a revolutionary instead of reformist theory and reorganizing the communist parties into revolutionary vanguards to prepare the masses for struggle and self-criticism. Leninism ultimately shattered three myths of orthodox Marxism that the Second International had held. That was 1, the working class couldn't take power if they were the minority in a peasant-majority country. 2, that the working class couldn't hold on to power if they happened to have a revolution in a peasant-majority country. And 3, that the working class shouldn't do general working class strikes, which the opportunists within the Second International didn't even believe in by the end of World War I of the revisionist clique. They stopped even believing in general worker strikes, instead hoping for reforms and implementing in socialism through voting it in peacefully. As you can see, global Marxism was in a really bad place before Leninism corrected a lot of the errors that were going on. Another important thing that Leninism did was it tied revolutionary theory with revolutionary practice. It stopped Marxism from becoming what Marx and Engels themselves had recognized was an issue with philosophy in general, which was idealism. It took Marxism into practice. Practice and theory do a beautiful dance together. As Stalin says, quote, "For theory must serve practice. Theory must answer the questions raised by practice." And, quote, "Theory assumes final shape only in close connection with the practical activity of a truly mass and truly revolutionary movement." Leninism was a revolutionary theory that served revolutionary practice as opposed to the revisionist reformist theories, which served no revolutionary practice whatsoever. Leninism, therefore, as much as we wish for leftist unity, was born out of a ruthless criticism of opportunistic leftist trends until only a truly revolutionary line was left. Many people often criticize Leninism as simply just rejection of theory over practice. However, that isn't what Leninism is at all. Leninism contends that without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. Leninism just simply says that theory becomes purposeless if it is not connected with that revolutionary practice. You need both. You need both a revolutionary theory and a revolutionary practice. If you only have practice without theory, you're going in blind and you're going to end up a failure. If you only have theory without practice, you're no better than the German philosophers that Marx and Engels were criticizing in the German ideology, the idealist philosophers who simply wanted to interpret the world. One of the greatest errors that Leninism solved was the issue of the spontaneity within the workers' movement. Leninism, through the conception of the disciplined vanguard party, recognized that a section of the working class will always be more class conscious, always be ahead, always be more quote-unquote advanced than others. This meant that in order to do revolutions, the vanguard disciplined party, which was made up of the most class conscious quote-unquote advanced workers, would lead the masses, the more quote-unquote backwards workers, into revolution. Spontaneity, or tailism, completely rejects all of this. Instead, it follows spontaneous movements of the working class that often have very short demands, which aren't necessarily a bad thing, but often lead to reformism. If the mass actions of the working class are not guided by a revolutionary vanguard party that has a goal, an ultimate goal of destroying capitalism, so often working class movements fizzle out into nothing. You can think of Occupy Wall Street or BLM. These were very spontaneous working class movements without a vanguard party leading them, without really any plans, that came onto the scene with a lot of energy, a lot of spontaneity, and then fizzled out. They either became incorporated into the state, right? Like BLM, which became incorporated into the Democratic State Party apparatus, or they fizzled out without meeting any of their demands. Ultimately, the working class, without being led by a vanguard disciplined party, is doomed to just keep on repeating these cycles of spontaneous movements that at best get reformist things done that get incorporated into the state. The vanguard Leninist party, made up of the most disciplined advanced leaders of the working class, give the working class that final oomph, that final leadership that allows them to finally destroy capitalism as a whole. Workers' revolution is inevitable. Proletarian revolution, socialist revolution, and eventually communism is inevitable because of three big things that Marxist-Leninism recognizes. One, that within the highly developed capitalist economies, big finance monopoly capitalist enterprises take over the entire country, suffocating the workers, leading to the most intense class struggles possible. Two, imperialism through the export of capital, leads to uneven development all across the world and allows for liberation through revolt and revolutionary crisis from the colonized fronts. And three, the inevitability of inter-imperialist struggle to redivide up the world market allows the working class a revolutionary window of opportunity as capitalism breaks down. The two great fronts against capitalism in the imperialist stage are, quote, the front of the revolutionary proletariat and the front of colonial emancipation. As Lenin would say, quote, imperialism is the eve of socialist revolution, end quote. Under the imperialist stage of capitalism, there is no such thing as an individual country or individual revolution. All countries now are tied to a world economy, and their revolutionary circumstances depend on the health or turmoil of the world economy as a whole. As Stalin says, revolution does not necessarily, especially workers' revolution, does not necessarily need to occur in the most highly developed economies on Earth. Instead, quote, the Leninist theory of revolution answers not necessarily that revolution will occur where industry is more developed and so forth. The front of capital will be pierced where the chain of imperialism is the weakest. For the proletarian revolution, it's a result of the breaking of the chain of world imperialist fronts at its weakest link. And it may turn out that the country which has started the revolution, which has made a breach in the front of capital, is less developed in a capitalist sense than other, more developed countries, which have, however, remained within the framework of capitalism. And that is historically how revolution has occurred. Proletarian revolution happened in China, in Vietnam, in the most underdeveloped economies in the world, in the weakest links of world capitalism and imperialism. Proletarian revolution, as Marx and Engels had originally thought of it, did not occur in the most developed economies like England, like Germany. Of course, towards the end of his life, Marx recognized that socialism and revolution could come from Russia, but the orthodox Marxists did not believe so at the time of the Second International. The goal of communists within colonized countries in the global south is to ally with all classes such as peasants in order to crush any feudal and colonial, neo-colonial orders that exist within their country, to retain power and revolutionary momentum to crush the bourgeoisie and implement in a socialist revolution. And of course, Stalin calls the theory of permanentists, the permanent theory of revolution, crazy. And he even quotes Lenin saying that, think why, for 10 whole years, life has passed by this fine theory. Yeah, so he quotes Lenin ridiculing the theory of permanent revolution. And if you want more information on that, you can check out my episode on Trotskyism or Leninism, where I go more into depth into that. Next, Stalin talks about the dictatorship of the proletariat, which has two principal jobs: to get the proletariat into power and to crush the reactionaries to proletarian power. This is because revolutions can happen without the dictatorship of the proletariat, but to maintain its victory and push forward to the final victory of socialism, unless at a certain stage in its development, it creates a special organization in the form of a dictatorship of the proletariat as its principal mainstay, revolutions always get crushed. Without a dictatorship of the proletariat, certainly a revolution may get to a point where it's able to overthrow the existing order, but a revolution cannot stay within power without the structure of the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is why anarchist revolutions always get crushed if they don't themselves create a dictatorship of the proletariat, which many anarchist experiments have technically done in every single way except name. The dictatorship of the proletariat as a tool to retain class rule under socialism is vital because the bourgeois exist as a class long after the revolution happens and continue to try to get back into power long after the revolution too. In fact, after the revolution, the bourgeois and petty bourgeois attack the socialist revolution with an energy tenfold of what they did before they were thrown out of power, with the most furious passion and hatred grown from 100-fold into the battle. In addition to that, you don't only have to worry about the bourgeois of your own nation attempting to restore capitalism, but also the bourgeoisie of the entire world capitalist system trying to get back into power. The dictatorship of the proletariat does not have an easy job under it. In its resistance and re-education and crushing of reactionary elements of society, it is one that needs to be done, but it's a very hard one to do. The dictatorship of the proletariat is the inevitable tool of using the state against the bourgeois order. It is the masses, the proletariat, the workers, for the first time using the state machinery, armies, police, institutions of the state, to oppress the minority, the old ruling classes. Throughout all of history, the state has always been used as a tool by the minority, the ruling classes, to oppress the majority, the ruled classes. And that's really where the state came out of, as Marx and Engels outlined. The state is made out of the contradiction between having a ruled class and a ruling class. And the ruling class created a state in order to maintain its power. The dictatorship of the proletariat simply sees the workers take the state and use the tools of the state to maintain themselves within power as long as the threat of bourgeois counter-revolution exists. Police, armies, things such as that. It follows then that the dictatorship of the proletariat is actually not as scary as it sounds. The word dictatorship is just an old word. The dictatorship of the proletariat, in fact, is a new form of democracy that has never been seen before. Quote, the dictatorship of the proletariat cannot be a complete democracy, a democracy for all, a democracy for the rich, as well as the poor. The dictatorship of the proletariat must be a state that is democratic in a new way for the working and non-propertied classes, and dictatorial in a new way against the bourgeoisie. The talk of Kautsky and co. about universal equality, about pure democracy, about perfect democracy, and the like, is a bourgeois disguise in the indubitable fact that equality between exploited and exploiters is impossible. The theory of pure democracy is the theory of the upper stratum of the working class, which has been broken in and is being fed by the imperialist robbers. It was brought into being for the purpose of concealing the ulcers of capitalism, of embellishing imperialism, and lending its moral strength in the struggle against the exploited masses. Under capitalism, there are no real liberties for the exploited, nor can there be, if for no reason than that premises, printing plants, paper supplies, etc., indispensable for enjoyment of liberties are a privilege of the exploiters. Under capitalism, the exploited masses do not, nor can they ever, really participate in governing their country, if for no other reason than, even under the most democratic regime, under conditions of capitalism, governments are not set up by the people, but by the Rothschilds, Stinneses, and Rockefellers and Morgans. Democracy under capitalism is capitalist democracy, the democracy of the exploiting minority based on the restriction of rights of the exploited majority and directed against this majority. Only under the dictatorship of the proletariat are real liberties for the first time enjoyed by the exploited classes of proletarians and peasants in governing the country. Under the dictatorship of the proletariat, democracy is proletarian democracy or workers' democracy. The democracy of the exploited majority based on restrictions and rights of the exploiting minority. End quote. So the dictatorship of the proletariat is democracy for the working class. There cannot never ever really be true democracy under capitalism, under a state which is under the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, under a dictatorship of the rich. Think about it. No matter who we choose at the ballot box, they've already been chosen for us. They've already been state-sponsored. They always do the bidding of the bourgeoisie. The dictatorship of the proletariat brings a radical new democracy to the working class for the first time that actually represents it, in which the working class uses the state as a tool for itself for the first time. Right now, the state is not in our hands. It is in the hands of multi-billionaires. It is in the hands of finance monopoly capitalists. And that is why the dictatorship of the proletariat brings about a true democracy. And if you really study Soviet democracy, it was a new kind of democracy which the world had never seen before. Workers for the first time had the right to fire or hire their bosses. People had says as to what would happen at their factories. There was mass participation in the government at the government level through local Soviets. Millions of people for the first time participated in the government. We can never hope for a democracy like that under capitalism because the levers to state power are in the hands of multi-billion-dollar finance monopoly capitalist companies like Tesla, like the Rockefellers. I don't even know if the Rockefellers are a rich family anymore, but the richest families within the world are the ones who really handle the state. And so I can't remember the last time I've participated within the government directly. You know, the most you can do under our current system is maybe go to a local town meeting and yell at your local council to pass legislation and cross your fingers that they actually do it. In addition to that, there's no democracy within your workplace, right? You don't get to choose what your company does when you give the majority of your working day to it. It's all in the hands of a board of tiny CEOs. If they decide to move somewhere, you're out of a job. If they decide to lower your pay, you're fucked. You have no say in what you spend the majority of your life doing. Isn't that crazy? Does the dictatorship of the proletariat simply take over the old state machinery? No, it completely smashes the old police, military, and governments and builds a new state in their place. Stalin mentions that even though Marx had conceded that socialism could be established peacefully and voted in the 1870s, this observation by Marx became completely outdated as soon as finance monopoly capitalism and imperialism burst onto the stage. So, a lot of revisionists will cite that Marx said that socialism could be voted in. Marx was talking in a completely different context than what we exist in today. Finance monopoly capitalism is a whole nother beast that did not exist in the weaker capitalism of Marx. What is finance monopoly capitalism? I realize I've been talking about it a lot. Finance monopoly capitalism is when monopolies, right? So these large mega corporations that grow and consolidate a bunch of companies under them merge with finance capital or banking capital, the capital of banks. And when these two combine, they become a whole nother beast entirely. And so these things take over entire countries. The dictatorship of the proletariat within the USSR was practiced through Soviets. These were local and international bodies of workers, councils, with mass participation from all sectors of society, including the various nationalities of the USSR. The USSR was a very multicultural nation. It wasn't just made up of Russians or Slavs. Another important thing that Leninism did was take the national question and expanded it to the colonized peoples of the world, something that Marxists before had refused to do to the quote-unquote uncivilized peoples. Before Leninism, Marxism, as was exercised by the Europeans, was very chauvinistic, very Eurocentric. And Stalin was the expert on the national questions. Lenin purposely put him as the head of the Commissar of Nationalities. Lenin had Stalin write on the national question. Stalin himself was part of one of the many nationalities, minority nationalities, ethnic nationalities that had been taken over by the Tsar state, the Georgians, which were considered lower than the regular Russians. And so Stalin, his bread and butter, his greatest contribution to theory is his contributions to the national question. That's something that even Lenin was able to recognize. And so when Stalin talks about the national question, you gotta listen, right? Like, that's all I'm saying. As Stalin says, quote, the national question was thereby transformed from a particular and internal state problem into a general and international problem, into a world problem of emancipating the oppressed peoples in the dependent countries and colonies from the yoke of imperialism, end quote. The right to self-determination of nations before Leninism had simply meant cultural expression under an empire, right? So before Leninism, the most you would get in terms of Marxists supporting the self-determination of a nation would simply be that you could exercise your cultural affairs freely and openly within a nation. You wouldn't be oppressed for exercising your cultural affairs. Leninism, however, expanded the right to self-determination to the right to create your own nation, the right to secession even, if need be. This is something that left communists often confuse within Leninism. They see the fight that Lenin had against cultural expression. Lenin was against the idea that cultural expression is enough, as Lenin opposing self-determination of nations in general. Stalin says, quote, in this way, the question of the oppressed nations become one of the supporting of the oppressed nations, of rendering real and continuous assistance to them in their struggle against imperialism, for real equalities of nations, for their independent existence as states. Inherently, proletarian revolution under imperialism cannot happen without the liberation of the colonies. And anyone that denies this falls into either reformism or chauvinism and Eurocentrism. We cannot have socialism or communism unless we are all free from colonialism. Within every single national liberation movement is the ability to overthrow imperialism and capitalism, and the ability to ally with a revolutionary proletariat to do so. The goal in Leninism of all workers in the imperial core countries is to support the liberation of those in the colonized countries that weaken imperialism. This is not blanket support for all liberation movements and national movements, no matter what they are. There are certainly reactionary ones, like, say, the Ukrainian movement, which is inherently linked with NATO expansionism and Western capital and imperialist systems themselves. But instead, the revolutionary national liberation movements that, quote, tend to weaken, to overthrow imperialism, and not to strengthen and preserve it, end quote. For example, the Palestinian liberation movement, even though it is led by jihadists, even though it is led by the national bourgeois of Palestine, is a liberation movement that weakens American world imperialism to its core and Western imperialism to its core and the imperialist system to its core, and therefore is a national liberation movement that must be supported. As Stalin writes, Marx supported the national movement of the Poles and the Hungarians, as opposed to the national movement of the Czechs and the South Slavs. Why? Because the Czechs and the South Slavs were then reactionary peoples, Russian outposts in Europe, outposts of absolutism, whereas the Poles and the Hungarians were revolutionary people fighting against absolutism. Because support of the national movement of the Czech and the South Slavs was at that time indirect support for Tsarism itself, the most dangerous enemy of revolutionary movements in Europe, end quote. Therefore, just because somebody calls themselves socialist, if their position strengthen imperialism, they are reactionary. For example, Bernie Sanders simply just calls for a reformism of American global finance monopoly capitalism and imperialism. And even if they are not socialist themselves, if their movements weaken imperialism, they are inherently progressive. The example that Stalin uses for his time is the Emir of Afghanistan. Stalin said that even though the Emir of Afghanistan was fighting for monarchism, since he was fighting against the imperialist global system, since he was fighting for the self-determination of Afghanistan, his national liberation movement in Afghanistan was still progressive. However, the Labour Party of Britain, which simply wanted to reform imperialism, which simply wanted to strengthen the imperialist system with a little bit more concessions for the working class within Britain, even though it called itself socialist, was still reactionary, was still regressive because it strengthened imperialism. And so we have to not only judge these movements by the content of their own characters, but also their relations to world imperialism itself. I can think of today, for example, Hamas and Bordigas, the two sides of a very different coin. One that strikes at the heart of world imperialism for the national liberation of a people that are about to be wiped out, and another, a movement that calls itself Marxist but says that the Palestinian people dying is just a normal part of capitalism, that we can't support any side in this war, and we have to just sit by and let these people die, hoping for a revolution to occur magically at some other date. One is very reactionary and strengthens world imperialism, Bordigism, and the other one strikes at its heart, because they're a national liberation movement that weakens imperialism itself, such as Hamas. A liberation movement is judged on the content of how it affects the world system as a whole. Whether or not Hamas is jihadist doesn't matter, because Hamas strikes a critical blow to American and European imperialist capitalism, enough that this even is somewhat leading to a crisis within capitalism itself. As Stalin posits, quote, the victory of the working class in the developed countries and liberation of the oppressed people from the yoke of imperialism are impossible without the formation and consolidation of a common revolutionary front, end quote. Leninism's greatest contribution was developing a scientific way to lead the workers to victory and to socialism, something that other Marxist branches were never able to do. The Vanguard Party, as formulated by Lenin, uses all the forces in society, peasants, workers in other countries, even not your own, revolutionary national independence movements, contradictions between classes, conflicts, wars. All of these are forces within a country, not just class forces, but also world forces, which are also class forces, but like they aren't classes themselves, like, conflicts, wars, for a decisive blow against capitalism and its overthrow through a workers' revolution during a revolutionary crisis. A revolution under the vanguard, then, has to be timed right at the climax of revolutionary crisis, not too early and not too soon. The vanguard always has to be in touch with the people, as, quote, failure to observe this condition leads to a dangerous error called loss of tempo, when the party lags behind the movement or runs far ahead of it, courting the danger of failure, end quote. The vanguard always has to be within step of the workers' movements. It can't be too far ahead of the workers' movement. It can't be too far behind the workers' movement. When the workers are ready to strike, the vanguard has to be at the forefront leading them. It can't call for a strike too early before the workers aren't ready for it, and it can't call for a strike long after the workers have already begun striking. As much as the offensive is needed by vanguard parties also need to know when to retreat and rally their forces during times of great reactionary pushback. For example, you can think of Mao's Long March, which would see the communists temporarily move to the remote regions of China as they were crushed under reactionary counter-revolution by the KMT. Quote, the object of the strategy of retreat is to gain time to disrupt the enemy, to accumulate the forces in order to later assume the offensive, end quote. The vanguard brings millions of people into politics and prepares them for the overthrow of the old regime and trains them to do so. Before the ultimate climax of a revolutionary crisis, there are little bursts of crises that occur. Right now, you can think of what's happening in America. We seem to have a crisis every other week. And as the system gets towards the end, there's going to be more and more and more of these little bursts before that final climax. Every one of these little bursts or revolutionary crises that occur before the climax prepare the masses and train them for the final oomph that they will need for that overthrow, that final push. Therefore, the Leninist Party needs to be connected with the masses and lead them through all of these small little hiccups before that big burp of revolution. I don't know why the fuck I use that analogy, but we're going with it. All right? Fuck it, we ball. Fuck it, we're doing it live. As Lenin said, propaganda and agitation alone are not enough. For this, the masses must have their own political experience, end quote. Tactical leadership requires the switching of strategies as the revolution enters different phases. This can be entering or exiting parliament, fostering alliances between middle and some rich peasants or breaking it for the poor peasants, making alliances or breaking alliances. Parties, strategies will always be flexible as conditions of revolution change. Lenin had many different strategies that changed all throughout the course of the Russian Revolution as the conditions of the revolution changed. How do you tell the difference between reformism and the need for being tactical, the need for being on top of the changing conditions of the revolution? Stalin answered this really nicely. Quote, with reformist tactics under the conditions of bourgeois rule, reforms are inevitably transformed into an instrument of strengthening the rule of the bourgeoisie, an instrument for disintegrating revolution. To a revolutionary, on the contrary, the main thing is revolutionary work and not reforms. To him, reforms or changing tactics are simply a byproduct of that ultimate revolution, end quote. Therefore, a reformist changes tactics for the goal of strengthening capitalism and begins to stop advocating for violent overthrow in general, getting lost in the reforms. A revolutionary changes tactics based on the need for that violent final overthrow. A revolutionary then, according to Lenin, quote, reforms are a byproduct of the revolutionary class struggle of the proletariat, end quote. The Leninist Party is one that is made up of the most advanced organs of the working class, as I mentioned before. Without this leadership, the working class movements are doomed. The party cannot simply just follow the working class movements, especially its reactionary tendencies. The party must stand at the head of the working class. It must see further than the working class. It must lead the proletariat, not drag the tail of spontaneous movements. Leading the working class does not mean the vanguard party is separate from the working class, does not mean it's in a dictatorial position from the working class. It is a detachment of the class, a part of the class, closely bound up with all fibers of its being. There is a dialectical relationship between leading the working class and being part of it, being enmeshed within it, but not reflecting its reactionary tendencies. Right? Think about organizing within America. A good Leninist party within America is connected with all the issues of the American working class and all of its needs. It needs food. It needs rent. It needs to fight the police state. But it doesn't reflect the reactionary tendencies of the American working class, the anti-migrant tendencies, the racist tendencies, the MAGA tendencies. That's known as tailism. We are leading the working class. We're enmeshed within it. We're reflecting all of its revolutionary potential. We're dropping all of its reactionary elements, and we're looking ahead while we're enmeshed within it. The party, therefore, has to be connected with the worker struggles and has to lead them through crisis. This means that not everybody can become a party member, not every single Joe off the street. There has to be some sort of standard that upcoming members have to pass before they become party members. All Leninist parties have to follow the principles of acting as one. Debates can happen within the party congresses, but once a party line is decided after the debates, everybody has to follow the party line. No minority factions can be allowed. The party acts as one and decides as one. Minority factions being allowed or factionalism leads these parties to become debate clubs. The party is also the ultimate advanced form of class struggle that leads all other branches such as trade unions, cooperatives, factory organizations, parliamentary groups, non-party women's associations, the press, cultural and educational organizations, youth leagues, revolutionary fighting organizations. All of these do their own job, but the vanguard party leads them. The vanguard party is also a tool for creating and maintaining the dictatorship of the proletariat, to put the working class into power at the helm of state, and to use that tool to keep them in power. As Stalin explains, quote, "Now what does maintain and expand the dictatorship mean? It means imbuing millions of proletarians with the spirit of discipline and organization. It means creating among the proletarian masses a cementing force, a bulwark against the corrosive influence of the petty bourgeois elements and the petty bourgeois habits. It means enhancing, organizing working class proletarians and re-educating them and remolding the petty bourgeois strata. It means helping the masses of the workers to educate themselves as a force capable of abolishing classes and preparing the conditions for the organization of socialist production." End quote. Finally, the Leninist Party must have regular purges of opportunistic elements, especially those that are seeking factionalism. If you really want a good example of this, you can go back to, again, my Trotskyism or Leninism episode. I expounded on this more there. And that is the foundations of Leninism. Ultimately, a very great introduction for Leninism, why Leninism is so important, why Leninism is not a specifically Russian ideology, but a universal ideology that was able to pick up on the trends of our current stage of finance monopoly capitalism. And ultimately, so many issues of capitalism have been perfectly described by Lenin, and the course of world capitalism has been predicted by Leninism to a T. if there is a future for humanity, it lies within Lenin. It lies under the banner of Stalin and Lenin. If there is extinction for humanity, it lies under the banner of capitalism. Thank you.
This episode of the Pokepreet Pod has been brought to you by our generous members on our Patreon. If you'd like to become one of them, go to patreon.com/thepokepreetpod. Thank you.
What the fuck? Glory to Stalin, I barely made it.
And a special shout out to our Marshal of the Soviet Union member, Matthias T. If you'd also like a shout out, please consider subscribing to our Patreon, where you can also get episodes up to a month early. Thank you.